You have been told that the world is ordered by virtue, that those who rule do so because they are wiser, more disciplined, more deserving. You have been told that wealth is the reward of moral excellence and poverty the evidence of personal failure. This lie has been repeated so often that it now walks among you disguised as common sense. But I tell you this, moral authority in our society does not rise from virtue, it rises from ownership. It is not conscience that governs the world, but capital, and capital has learned to speak in the language of morality. In every epoch, the ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideas of the ruling class. This is not an accident, nor a conspiracy whispered in dark rooms, but the natural consequence of material power. Those who control the means of production also control the means of thought. They decide not only what is produced, but what is praised, not only what is consumed, but what is considered right, normal, and inevitable. Economic power does not merely dominate the body, it colonizes the mind. Observe how the market presents itself as neutral, as a natural force like gravity or weather. We are told that competition is justice, that profit is proof of contribution, that success is the measure of worth. Yet these moral claims are not eternal truths, they are ideological weapons forged to protect property. When exploitation becomes routine, it must be justified. When inequality grows unbearable, it must be sanctified. Thus, economic domination quietly transforms itself into moral authority. The worker sells labor not because it is noble, but because survival demands it. The wage relation is presented as fair exchange, yet it is built upon an imbalance so profound that it disappears from sight. One class owns the factories, the land, the machines, the platforms of modern life. The other owns nothing but its capacity to work. From this inequality arises profit, extracted not from innovation alone, but from unpaid labor. And yet, the one who profits is praised as industrious, while the one who labors is told to be grateful. This is how morality is inverted. The system that depends on exploitation calls itself ethical. The class that lives from the labor of others presents itself as the guardian of order and responsibility. Charity replaces justice, obedience replaces dignity, and patience is preached to those who are robbed daily of the value they create. Poverty is no longer seen as a social crime, but as a personal defect. Wealth is no longer questioned, but admired as evidence of superior character. Do not be deceived, morality under capitalism is not universal, it is selective. Theft is condemned when committed by the hungry, but celebrated when committed by the powerful through speculation, privatization, and legal plunder. Violence is denounced when it erupts from desperation, yet normalized when it appears as layoffs, austerity, and the silent destruction of lives in the name of efficiency. The law itself bends before property, treating exploitation as a right and resistance as a threat. Religion, education, and culture are recruited to this task. They teach submission as virtue, endurance as wisdom, and suffering as destiny. They promise rewards elsewhere while demanding obedience here. They turn historical conditions into eternal truths, persuading the oppressed that the world could be no other way. Thus, domination becomes invisible and injustice appears natural. But history is not written by morality, it is written by struggle. Every social order that declared itself eternal has been overturned by those it oppressed. Feudal lords once claimed divine right. Today, capital claims moral right. Both rest on the same foundation, control over material life. And just as the serf shattered the illusion of sacred hierarchy, so too must the working class shatter the illusion that wealth equals virtue. The worker is not poor because they lack discipline, they are poor because the value they produce is stolen. The unemployed are not useless, they are made redundant by a system that values profit over human life. The oppressed are not silent because they agree, but because they have been fragmented, isolated, and taught to blame themselves instead of the structure that exploits them. This is why unity terrifies the ruling class more than any weapon. When workers recognize themselves not as competitors but as comrades, the moral authority of capital collapses. When they see that their suffering is shared, their isolation ends. Consciousness is the beginning of resistance, and organization is its force. The moment the exploited understand that the system depends on their labor, the system stands exposed. Do not ask the ruling class for moral permission to be free. They will never grant it. Their morality exists only to preserve their power. Justice will not descend from above. It must rise from below. Rights are not gifts bestowed by the powerful. They are victories seized by the organized many. The task before you is not merely to demand better wages or kinder masters, but to challenge the foundation of a system that turns economic power into moral supremacy. You must reject the lie that exploitation is natural, that inequality is deserved, that obedience is ethical. You must reclaim morality itself, grounding it not in profit, but in human need, not in ownership, but in collective dignity. The working class carries within it the capacity to transform society because it produces society. It builds the cities, runs the machines, sustains life itself. When it moves together, no ideology can restrain it, no moral sermon can pacify it. The future does not belong to those who hoard wealth and call it virtue. It belongs to those who create, who struggle, who refuse to accept a world where power disguises itself as morality. Let the veil be torn away. Let economic domination be named for what it is, and let the oppressed rise, not as individuals seeking mercy, but as a class demanding justice, determined to reclaim not only the wealth they produce, but the moral authority stolen from them. Economic power is not simply the possession of material wealth, it is the capacity to shape the very framework of society, to dictate the terms under which life itself is measured and valued. Those who hold economic power are able to define what is just, what is normal, and what is virtuous, often without a single word spoken in overt coercion. The illusion of moral authority emerges when the concentration of wealth is presented as a natural hierarchy, as if financial success were proof of superior judgment, intelligence, or character. This illusion is not an accident, nor is it a deception limited to a few cunning individuals. It is a systemic feature of capitalist society, arising from the structures of property, labor, and the mechanisms that govern production and distribution. Economic power becomes a lens through which social norms are filtered, and through this lens, the disparity between wealth and poverty is transformed into a moral narrative that justifies inequality. The rich are not merely rich, they are framed as deserving, responsible, and virtuous, while the poor are presented as deficient, lazy, or lacking in foresight, despite the reality that their condition is the product of systemic exploitation and structural constraints. This conflation of wealth with virtue is reinforced through institutions that claim to be neutral arbiters of fairness and morality. Education, media, religion, and the legal system are enlisted to perpetuate the narrative that economic success reflects moral superiority, and that social hierarchies are the natural order of life. Textbooks teach children that hard work leads to reward. Advertisements glorify consumerism as a symbol of personal merit, and sermons praise the generosity of the wealthy while encouraging the poor to accept suffering with patience and humility. These cultural reinforcements create a moral environment in which exploitation is normalized and even sanctified, producing a populace that internalizes the values of the powerful as universal truths. The illusion becomes self-perpetuating because economic power also controls the means of production, not only in the material sense, but in the ideological sense. Those who own factories, land, banks, and platforms of communication can shape discourse, determine which ideas gain legitimacy, and marginalize or silence narratives that challenge the prevailing moral framework. This control allows economic elites to frame social problems in ways that protect their interests, presenting policies, practices, and social arrangements that favor their continued accumulation of wealth as rational and morally sound. For example, wage suppression, labor precariousness, and the commodification of essential services are reframed as efficiency, innovation, and responsibility. Meanwhile, the structural causes of poverty and inequality are obscured, and those affected are blamed for circumstances that are not of their making. The psychological effect of this illusion is profound. Workers are led to question their own worth, to accept conditions that are exploitative, and to see themselves as morally inferior or deficient because they are not able to achieve the same accumulation of wealth as the ruling class. This internalization of moral judgment weakens collective action and divides the working class, as individuals come to see social outcomes as reflections of personal merit rather than systemic oppression. Moreover, the illusion of moral authority allows economic elites to exercise power with minimal resistance, because their actions are framed as not only legal but righteous. Profits extracted from labor are reinterpreted as evidence of industriousness, strategic insight, or the ability to take risks, rather than as the appropriation of the value produced by others. Conversely, demands for fair wages, equitable conditions, or social reforms are often portrayed as greed, disruption, or immorality, creating a moral asymmetry in which those seeking justice are condemned while those defending exploitation are lauded. This dynamic is visible in every sector of society, from multinational corporations whose global influence shapes public policy, to local landlords whose control over housing dictates living conditions, to media conglomerates whose narratives define cultural values. In each case, the possession of economic power enables individuals and institutions to speak with moral authority, asserting a right to guide social norms, enforce compliance, and adjudicate the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Yet this authority is not derived from ethical reasoning or universal principles, but from the structural power embedded in property relations. The moral language used by the wealthy serves primarily to legitimize and entrench their control, disguising material domination as ethical guidance. It convinces the masses that inequality is a natural order and that moral responsibility aligns with the interests of those who already dominate society. The result is a society in which economic hierarchy masquerades as moral hierarchy, where the accumulation of wealth is celebrated as a sign of virtue, and where the suffering of the majority is rendered invisible, rationalized, or blamed on personal failings. By presenting economic power as morally justified, the ruling class maintains its dominance while minimizing the likelihood of resistance, ensuring that exploitation continues unchallenged and that social norms reinforce rather than contest structural inequality. Capitalist ideology is not merely an economic system. It is a pervasive worldview that penetrates every corner of society, shaping the way individuals perceive themselves, others, and the structures that govern their lives. At its core, this ideology presents the mechanisms of exploitation not as instruments of oppression, but as markers of virtue and merit. The extraction of surplus labor, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, and the relentless drive for profit are all framed as natural, necessary, and morally justified. Within this framework, those who succeed financially are celebrated as industrious, intelligent, and morally superior, while those who struggle are cast as negligent, unmotivated, or undeserving. The ideological work of capitalism transforms what is fundamentally an imposition of power and extraction of value into a moral hierarchy, convincing the oppressed that their own subjugation is either deserved or the result of personal failure, rather than systemic oppression. This moral alchemy operates in multiple dimensions, from the narratives embedded in education to the symbols and stories circulated by culture and media. Schools teach children that hard work and perseverance inevitably lead to success, glossing over the structural barriers, wage suppression and unequal access to resources that prevent millions from achieving economic security. Textbooks celebrate entrepreneurs and magnates as exemplars of ingenuity and ethical diligence, while rarely acknowledging the labor of workers who produce the wealth that these figures accumulate. Media further amplifies these messages, portraying billionaires as paragons of moral and practical wisdom, offering philanthropy and charity as demonstrations of their virtue, while simultaneously framing collective demands for justice, fair wages, or social support as selfish, disruptive, or immoral. Religion, too, is often co-opted to reinforce the same narrative, teaching submission, endurance, and gratitude among the poor, while extolling the generosity of the wealthy as a moral exemplar. The ideology of capitalism thereby masks exploitation as a series of virtuous acts, aligning ethical approval with the interests of the ruling class. The logic of meritocracy, a central pillar of capitalist ideology, is particularly powerful in this regard. It asserts that success is earned through individual effort, intelligence, and moral rectitude, while failure signals deficiency of character. Yet this conception of merit ignores the conditions under which labor is performed, the mechanisms of appropriation, and the structural inequalities that shape opportunity. The worker's labor is necessary for wealth creation, yet the capitalist claims the lion's share of value produced, presenting this appropriation as fair reward for vision, risk-taking, or managerial skill. The disparity between effort and reward, between contribution and recognition, is thus obscured by moralized narratives that equate accumulation with virtue. Exploitation is also justified through appeals to efficiency and competition. The relentless pursuit of profit is depicted as a moral imperative, a duty to maximize productivity, innovate, and create value for society at large. This framing disguises the human cost of exploitation, transforming layoffs, wage cuts, precarious labor, and unsafe working conditions into neutral or even commendable actions, necessary for the greater good. The worker's suffering becomes collateral in a moral economy that valorizes success at any cost, celebrating those who extract maximum gain from labor as responsible stewards of resources and risk. In addition, capitalist ideology enlists the language of choice and consent to obscure coercion. The worker's need to sell labor is reframed as a voluntary transaction, as if the necessity of survival confers moral legitimacy upon the unequal terms of exchange. The consent, extracted from material necessity, is presented as proof of fairness, turning structural exploitation into an ethical interaction, and obscuring the reality that the laborer's dependence on wages is a product of a system designed to concentrate wealth. Class distinctions are further naturalized, with the affluent portrayed as guardians of society, capable of guiding markets, shaping culture, and setting standards for behavior. The moral authority of wealth thus extends beyond the economic domain, defining norms, prescribing conduct, and sanctioning deviation. Acts of accumulation are moralized, acts of resistance are criminalized or demonized. Within this system, the oppressed internalize the ideology, judging themselves according to the standards of their exploiters, creating divisions and self-blame that weaken the potential for collective action. The ideological justification of exploitation also functions to depoliticize the working class. When exploitation is framed as virtue, inequality as merit, and subjugation as personal failing, systemic critique is rendered unnecessary or illegitimate. Social problems are individualized, presented as failures of character or effort rather than consequences of structural design. The narrative of virtue cloaks the mechanisms of domination, ensuring that exploitation is perpetuated not only through material coercion but through the consent manufactured by ideology. Capitalist ideology, therefore, does not merely rationalize existing relations of production, it reshapes moral consciousness, aligning ethical values with the interests of the ruling class. By presenting exploitation as virtuous, the system secures compliance, obscures injustice, and transforms the pursuit of profit into a moral duty, while simultaneously delegitimizing demands for equity, collective rights, and systemic change. In this way, capitalism wields morality as a weapon to protect its own survival, convincing the majority that their own subjugation is not only natural but ethically warranted, and that the domination they experience is a reflection of virtue rather than an imposition of power. In capitalist society, wealth is celebrated as the highest measure of success, while labour, the very source of that wealth, is systematically undervalued. The logic of accumulation has been moralized to the point that those who possess riches are admired for their supposed skill, intelligence, or industriousness. Yet the labourers whose effort, time, and creativity produce the material foundation of society are treated as interchangeable, replaceable, and dispensable. This inversion of value is neither accidental nor incidental. It is a deliberate ideological construction designed to protect the privileges of the owning class and obscure the reality of exploitation. The worker, who constructs buildings, manufactures goods, provides services, and sustains social life itself, is rendered invisible in public admiration, while the owner, the investor, or the executive receives accolades for having earned what was collectively produced. The social and cultural mechanisms that reinforce this hierarchy begin early in life. Children are taught to admire success in terms of material accumulation rather than the labour and ingenuity required to sustain society. Textbooks and media highlight the exploits of billionaires, celebrities, and entrepreneurs, portraying them as heroes whose moral character is proven by their wealth. Meanwhile, the daily toil of nurses, factory workers, teachers, janitors, and delivery personnel, the labour that ensures society functions, is treated as ordinary, unremarkable, and morally neutral. This social framing produces a worldview in which accumulation becomes synonymous with virtue, and work itself, especially labour that is essential but not high-paying or high-profile, becomes morally invisible. Economically, the devaluation of labour is codified through wage suppression, precarious employment, and the extraction of surplus value. The capitalist system is structured so that workers receive only a fraction of the wealth they create. The remainder is appropriated as profit, rent, or interest. This material imbalance is justified ideologically through the belief that profit is the reward for skillful management or risk-taking, rather than the product of systematic exploitation of labour. The result is a society in which wealth is celebrated as evidence of worth, while the labourer, whose contribution is indispensable, is treated as morally and socially subordinate. This moral framing has profound psychological consequences for the working class. Workers are encouraged to internalize the notion that their labour is less valuable than capital, that their efforts are mere instruments to enrich others rather than legitimate achievements in their own right. This internalization erodes collective consciousness and solidarity, fostering competition among labourers and diverting attention away from systemic inequalities. The devaluation of labour extends beyond material recognition and into social prestige. Occupations dominated by workers are often stigmatized as low status, even when they require extraordinary skill, knowledge, or responsibility. Professions that serve the needs of the wealthy or facilitate capital accumulation are granted prestige regardless of their social utility, while essential labor that sustains life and society is marginalized. This produces a cultural hierarchy in which the worth of an individual is measured not by their contribution to society, but by their proximity to capital, further entrenching inequality and justifying exploitation as natural. The state and law reinforce this dynamic by protecting property rights over labor rights, legitimizing the accumulation of wealth while allowing labor to remain insecure and undervalued. Tax systems, legal protections for investors, and corporate-friendly regulations privilege those who own wealth, signaling to society that the accumulation of capital is socially and morally superior to labor itself. Labor, even when performed under dangerous or dehumanizing conditions, is framed as the worker's duty rather than a source of social and economic power. Media and culture perpetuate this disparity through narratives of individualism and meritocracy. Stories celebrate entrepreneurs who earned their riches through cleverness and risk-taking, obscuring the structural conditions, social labor, and collective contributions that enabled their success. Conversely, strikes, demands for fair wages, and labor movements are portrayed as disturbances, greed, or inefficiency, rather than legitimate claims for recognition and justice. The social imagination is thus oriented to admire wealth and disregard labor, creating an ethical inversion that naturalizes inequality. The impact of this inversion extends into education, where technical skills and labor-intensive knowledge are often undervalued compared to management, finance, or entrepreneurial training. Students are guided toward professions associated with higher remuneration and status, reinforcing the perception that work is valuable only insofar as it generates wealth for others, while essential but lower-paid labor is treated as unworthy of respect. On a global scale, this dynamic magnifies inequality as labor in poorer nations is exploited to generate wealth for multinational corporations and investors in wealthier nations. The labor of millions becomes invisible in the narrative of progress and civilization, while the accumulation of wealth in distant capitals is celebrated as innovation and moral achievement. In every sphere of society, then, the praise of wealth and the devaluation of labor serve to legitimize the social order and ensure compliance. Workers are conditioned to admire the very system that exploits them, to measure their own worth against accumulation rather than contribution, and to accept as natural the hierarchy that places the capitalist above the laborer, the moral and ideological reinforce me. NT of this hierarchy transforms economic exploitation into a social norm, masking the structural dependency of wealth on labor and disguising injustice as merit, while the labor that sustains society is relegated to invisibility, undervalued materially, socially, and morally, ensuring that those who produce remain subordinate to those who merely own. The power of the working class lies not merely in the labor it performs, but in its collective capacity to understand the conditions of its own exploitation, and to act in concert to transform them. Consciousness is the first step toward liberation, for without awareness of the structures that bind them, workers remain complicit in their own oppression, accepting as natural the injustices that profit the ruling class. False morality, which celebrates wealth and venerates capital while devaluing labor, derives its authority from the perception of inevitability and consent. It thrives on the isolation, competition, and fragmentation of workers, convincing each individual that their fate is singular, personal, and unalterable. To dismantle this moral illusion, the working class must first awaken to the recognition that their subjugation is not an accident of fate, but the deliberate product of a social and economic system designed to exploit them. Consciousness involves understanding that wealth is not a reward for virtue, but the result of the extraction of surplus labor, that property is not a neutral possession, but a mechanism of power that dictates access, opportunity, and social standing, and that social hierarchies are not moral imperatives, but instruments of domination. Once workers recognize the structural roots of our oppression, the moral authority of the ruling class begins to erode. Unity amplifies this consciousness, transforming isolated awareness into collective strength. The solidarity of workers, forged through shared struggle and organized action, creates a social force capable of challenging the ideological narratives that uphold exploitation. When workers unite, the notion that inequality is deserved or natural is exposed as a lie, for it becomes clear that the same labor that sustains the wealth of a few sustains society itself. The unified action of the working class reveals the dependency of capital on labor, undermining the moral claims of those who profit without producing. Strikes, protests, and organized movements demonstrate the tangible power of collective labor, making visible what ideology seeks to conceal, that production and sustenance are the achievements of the many, not the privileges of the few. Consciousness and unity, together, also enable workers to craft alternative moral frameworks rooted in human need rather than accumulation, in cooperation rather than competition. By asserting that dignity, fairness, and equitable access to resources are ethical imperatives, the working class challenges the morality imposed by capital. These principles reject the glorification of wealth and the devaluation of labor, affirming instead that labor itself is the foundation of social value and that exploitation is a moral wrong, not a neutral or virtuous arrangement. Education, discussion, and political engagement are tools for spreading this consciousness, transforming private understanding into collective insight. Through these processes, workers learn to see beyond the narratives that pit them against one another and to identify the structural mechanisms of domination. They begin to recognize patterns of wage suppression, precarious employment, and labor extraction as deliberate tactics to maintain control, rather than as unfortunate accidents or personal failings. With shared understanding comes the capacity for coordinated action, whether through unions, cooperatives, political movements, or social campaigns, each reinforcing the principle that strength lies in solidarity. The moral authority claimed by the wealthy is predicated on invisibility and division, on the isolation of laborers from one another, and from the consequences of their collective power. When workers unite and act with awareness, this authority collapses because it can no longer hide behind the illusion of inevitability. Collective labor demonstrates that wealth is not a natural measure of virtue, but a byproduct of social arrangements that can be reorganized in favor of justice. Furthermore, the consciousness of the working class enables the critique of ideology itself. By analyzing media, education, law, and religion, workers can discern how each institution serves to maintain the dominance of capital and obscure the value of labor. This critique is essential, for false morality is not merely a superficial belief, it is deeply embedded in social practice and cultural understanding. Awareness allows workers to challenge narratives that frame poverty as moral failure and profit as virtue, replacing them with ethical reasoning grounded in the lived reality of exploitation and cooperation. Historical struggles of labor, from the earliest strikes to modern social movie, NTS, illustrate the power of conscious unity. Victories for fair wages, safe working conditions, and political representation were achieved not by individual heroism, but by collective organization and shared understanding of systemic injustice. Each act of solidarity reinforces the moral principle that exploitation is wrong and labor is valuable, slowly dismantling the ideological structures that have long justified inequality. In this way, the working class does not merely fight for material gain, it fights for moral legitimacy. By asserting the inherent value of collective labor and exposing the moral illusions of capital, workers redefine the ethical framework of society. False morality loses its power when it can no longer claim inevitability, when the exploited recognize both the mechanisms of their oppression and the power they hold when united, and when collective consciousness transforms labor from a tool of domination into a source of dignity, agency, and social justice. Justice and moral authority are not abstract concepts that descend from heaven or are granted by those who already wield power. They are claims that must be recognized, asserted, and taken by those whose labor and lives have been subordinated to the interests of others. In a society structured by capitalist exploitation, justice is continually deferred, masked by the language of legality, fairness, and tradition, while moral authority is monopolized by those who control wealth and property. The ruling class presents itself as the arbiter of what is ethical, what is proper, and what is virtuous, using its economic dominance to frame social norms and to justify inequality. Yet the ethical legitimacy of this authority is not inherent. It is enforced through institutions, ideology, and structural power, and it exists precisely because the oppressed have been fragmented, silenced, and persuaded to accept their subjugation as natural or deserved. To reclaim justice, the oppressed must first recognize that moral authority cannot reside permanently with those whose wealth depends upon exploitation. The legitimacy claimed by capital is constructed, maintained, and reproduced through social consensus, often achieved under conditions of coercion, indoctrination, and social pressure. When workers, peasants, and marginalized communities awaken to the reality that the accumulation of wealth has been built upon their labor, the moral claims of the ruling class lose their weight. Awareness of structural inequality transforms passive acceptance into critical scrutiny, revealing the contradictions between the professed ethics of society and the lived experience of exploitation, deprivation, and social exclusion. Reclaiming moral authority requires organization and solidarity, for justice is never achieved through isolated action. The fragmentation of the oppressed is one of the most effective instruments of domination. When individuals are pitted against one another, blame is internalized, competition becomes moralized, and the capacity for collective struggle diminishes. Conscious unity allows the oppressed to articulate shared interests, identify common enemies, and assert the validity of their claims in a moral framework that recognizes the intrinsic value of labor, cooperation, and human dignity. The process of reclaiming moral authority also entails the development of an alternative ethical vision, one rooted not in property, accumulation, or hierarchical power, but in the principles of equity, solidarity, and the collective well-being of society. By defining justice as the fair distribution of wealth, the recognition of labor's value, and the protection of human life and opportunity, the oppressed can challenge the prevailing moral order, demonstrating that authority need not reside with those who exploit, but can instead arise from those whose labor sustains civilization. Historical experience confirms that such reclamation is both possible and transformative. Revolutions, labor movements, and struggles for civil rights illustrate that moral authority can be wrested from the hands of the few when the many act collectively, guided by a shared consciousness of justice. Each strike, protest, or organized campaign is an assertion that ethical legitimacy is not the privilege of wealth, but the right of those whose labor and life have been subordinated. The act of claiming justice is inseparable from action. demands for fair wages, safe conditions, political representation, and social recognition are expressions of moral authority in practice, not abstract ideals. Through struggle, the oppressed demonstrate that morality is not inherent in capital, law, or tradition, but in the capacity of humans to organize, resist, and insist upon recognition of their worth. This reclamation of moral authority challenges the ideological foundations of capitalism, revealing the contradictions between the exaltation of property and the neglect of labor, between the sanctification of wealth and the devaluation of human effort. By asserting their own ethical claim, the oppressed dismantle the narrative that exploitation is virtuous, that poverty is deserved, and that inequality is natural. The process of reclaiming justice also requires cultural, educational, and political engagement. It demands the reinterpretation of history, the exposure of ideological manipulation, and the dissemination of knowledge that empowers collective awareness. When workers and marginalized communities understand how laws, media, and institutions have been shaped to protect the interests of the few, they gain the tools to assert alternative moral frameworks that prioritize equity, dignity, and shared responsibility. Reclaiming moral authority is inseparable from the pursuit of systemic transformation. To recognize the legitimacy of labor, to demand the redistribution of resources, and to assert the right to participate fully in shaping society, the oppressed must not only critique the existing moral order, but also construct a new ethical reality grounded in the recognition of their agency and value. Each act of solidarity, each challenge to injustice, reinforces the principle that moral authority belongs not to those who exploit, but to those whose collective strength sustains society. By asserting justice through organization, consciousness, and action, the oppressed destabilize the claims of the ruling class, expose the moral bankruptcy of exploitation, and establish a foundation for a society in which ethical legitimacy aligns with the needs, labor, and dignity of the majority, rather than the accumulation and preservation of wealth by a privileged few. In conclusion, the world we inhabit is not governed by virtue or moral excellence, but by the concentration of economic power, which masquerades as justice, righteousness, and authority. Wealth is praised while labor is devalued, exploitation is justified as virtue, and false morality persuades the oppressed to accept their own subjugation as natural. Yet history and reason reveal that this moral authority is neither permanent nor inherent. It is constructed, maintained, and can be dismantled. The path to liberation lies in the consciousness and unity of the working class, in the recognition of shared exploitation, and in the collective action that asserts the true value of labor over the illusions of capital. Justice and moral authority do not descend from the powerful. They must be reclaimed by those whose hands and minds sustain society. Only when the oppressed rise together, armed with awareness, solidarity, and determination, can the false morality of the ruling class be exposed, and a new social order rooted in equity, dignity, and human necessity be forged.